Okay, you're welcome to GOV 830. That's Terrorism and Banditry in Nigeria. This course is going to cover a wide range of issues that we're going to deal with, and I'm going to send the course outline to your group chat. And I would really encourage you to try and read the texts, texts that are in the course outline, and also some of the materials that will be sent to you. Try and go through them so that the classes will make more sense while we're going through it. But I'm sure that you'll find the course interesting because we're going to be dealing with issues that you are a little bit conversant with. So this first class is going to be an introduction. I'm going to uh, provide an introductory class to the concepts that we're going to be dealing with. What is terrorism? What is banditry? Try and place that in context. And then as we continue to delve into the course outline for the course, we, keep expanding the issues that are at stake as we look through the entire course. So when we start with terrorism, we try to first of all understand what terrorism is, to try to define it. Although a standard definition of terrorism is a bit challenging because terrorism is perceived by different institutions, people's groups, ideological persuasions differently. They look at terrorism differently and they choose to conceptualize it differently. However, for the purpose of this course, we're going to consider terrorism as either the act of using violence, okay, either the use of violence or the threat or the use of violence to compel a group of people, state, institutions to obey or to align itself with certain ideological positions or actions. Essentially, we're looking at either an individual, a group, even governments that use violence or the threat of violence to compel obedience, to compel conformity, so to speak, to a particular position, a particular demand, a particular ideology. Okay, so when you look at this definition, we discover that there are certain key words in this definition that essentially pin down the understanding of terrorism. The use of violence, which is one. When we try to understand terrorism, we must have at the back of our mind that terrorism must, at every point in time, utilize violence. Now, that use of violence may be the threat of the use of violence or the actual use of violence. So, like I said in the definition that we're trying to use to understand terrorism, it is either the use or threat of use of violence. So, violence is at the fundamental, basis of terrorism. Is a root, foundational structure of our attempt to understand terrorism. So the threat or use of violence to compel, okay, the doing word there is to compel or to influence or to pressure an individual, a group of persons, an institution, a government. Okay, so the use of violence by groups, individuals, or governments to do the same, okay, compel the same set of people on the other side. So an individual can be a terrorist that is attempting to compel a government, or or a terrorist or a terrorist group can attempt to compel a government or another group or institutions, or an institution or a government can attempt to compel groups or other governments. So essentially, you will discover that terrorism is a method, and that method can be utilized by anybody all in order to further their agenda. And that agenda, we said in the definition that we're trying to use, is either an ideological position, it can be an ideological political position, okay, but regardless, it is a position that the terrorist or the terrorist group wants the other person or the other group or the other government to conform to. It's a request, a decision, a position, an ideology that they want. They insist and are willing to compel the other person or government or institution or group to follow, to concede, to conform to. So essentially, these are basic, three catchment areas, so to speak, in an attempt to understand what terrorism is. So to place this in context, we have to also study or do an in-depth discourse on what are terrorist groups, because it is not as simple to label anybody that uses the terrorist methodology as a terrorist group. Because, like I said, terrorism is a method, is a violent method that can be used by any group at all to bring about conformity to its ideological positions or what it wants. However, before a group, persons, or institutions can be labeled or referred to as a terrorist group, then there are certain things that, have to be in place. Okay. And some of these things are the issues we're going to deal with in the course in order to understand the labeling when it comes to terrorism, because there's a popular saying that says, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So, depending on the perception or perspective from which we view or look at or perceive the agency of a particular group that is using terrorist methodology, we can either, see them as, freedom fighters or revolutionary groups, or terrorist groups. So that aspect of the course is very critical. It helps the student of conflict resolution to be able to properly assess the belligerents in a particular conflict. Because the fact that one group has labeled another group as a terrorist group does not necessarily mean that that group is, in fact, a terrorist group. They may use terrorist methodology, but the labeling of a group as a terrorist group is also another, let's say, instrument in the hands of either government or other groups, to create a certain level of propaganda that benefits them. So the student of peace and conflict resolution strategy studies must, put that at the back of your mind. Always put that. Students of peace and conflict resolution and strategy must always have that at the back of their minds. Who is doing the labeling when it comes to what a terrorist group is or what a terrorist group is not, and what is the agenda behind the labeling? Why are we considering this group as a terrorist group and not considering this as a terrorist group? Now, we're going to find out that that's very, very interesting. It's actually very interesting that we'll find in sundry times that several groups are usually not considered to be terrorist group, regardless of the fact that they are using and utilizing terrorist methodology. Like I mentioned earlier on, we have governments that have used terrorist methodology severally, and they are not considered to be terrorist group, regardless of the fact that they're. So essentially, these key issues need to be understood, properly understood, and placed in context when we study terrorism in relation to banditry, insurgency, and so on and so forth, both at the local, regional, and also at the international level. Okay, these are critical.